What an inflammatory assertion. Religion? You mean the vast majority of people's beliefs and faiths in the universe and origins of man and the purpose of life are nothing more than fairy tales? The fuck is wrong with you, Nick, you cunt? Religion, not just at a glance, but also when looked at with a closer observation, appears to be the very foundation holding up our modern society, mostly because religious teachings are the framework of the majority of people's ethical decision-making processes. Well, by majority, I more so mean everybody. Yes, even atheists, members of the modern secular world who clearly subscribe solely to the positions of science and reason, have had their moral compass influenced by religion in more ways than they would like to see. I think an interesting question is, well, why exactly? Why are morals seemingly entirely influenced by religion, and if religion never existed, would we be innately morally corrupt? Is it even true to say that modern moral and ethical philosophy were birthed from religion? To answer this, we must first journey to ancient Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization, of course, and consequently religion. However, the truth is far more complex than simply stating this is where religion started, because the real truth is that wherever man has collectively assembled, religion or some form of paradoxical explanation for unexplainable events, of which there are many, had sprung into existence. The Sumerians are, however, the oldest recorded civilization, thus for all intents and purposes, we can assume that their creation story and explanation for the world, aside from general tribal shamanism, came first. We can't, however, simply observe and contemplate the beliefs held by the ancient Sumerians. Instead, we must truly put ourselves in their shoes and dissect completely the thought process surrounding the creation of the first religion or myth, as it should more properly be labeled. The world before the collectivization of man was an extremely hostile place for our species. While we were very adept at hunting and scavenging, placing us high up on the proverbial totem pole, nature still represented chaos, which is the opposite of order or of knowing. This is because nature isn't straightforward. You don't know what you get with nature, because nature can give or nature can take away, seemingly at random. In our modern times, we can somewhat predict the patterns of our environment, but even then, our predictions are rarely without fault. Imagine being an ancient spear hunter in a tribe like fucking 50 dudes, walking around the jungle in 90-degree heat with giant lizard monsters and tigers around every corner. I think it's safe to say we fucking hated that shit because we couldn't very well predict what would happen to us in an environment such as that. So then, man would naturally try and digress as far as possible from this state of existence. Nature was and is the very real representation of chaos, and when chaos manifests itself in our modern personal lives, or in other terms, when an extremely unexpected event occurs and we don't yet know if this event is a positive or a negative, or if it is in fact a negative, we usually respond neurologically with the production of cortisol or stress, which is a very negative but useful sometimes hormone. Imagine living in a world where that hormone was produced on a way more frequent basis, for reasons that aren't, fuck me, I forgot to bring my MasterCard to the Haskell, now I can't bet without my wife finding out, you know? Super relatable situation. Because these trivialities are what usually bring us into stressful states now, not life or death scenario. It was probably a very scary place for the humans that lived in a time where we were still capable of being preyed upon by things that wanted to eat us, not insurance companies and banks. Actually, never mind. Imagine the first collection of man in a city or even a village. But don't just imagine what it looked like. Imagine what it felt like to go from being completely subjected to the natural world to being subjected to it only when you left the walls of this self-made protective construct. A construct that doesn't manifest itself naturally, only when man has decided to create it. This was possible because we humans are capable of not only interpreting our environment with our senses, like any other organism in our biosphere, and then reacting to the said sensory information, but also we are able to contemplate the reasoning for the environment being the way it is and how it is able to be changed. This capability is what ultimately led us to want to directly interfere with the natural world, or chaos, and also to change and manipulate the environment to our advantage, so as to circumvent the effects of chaos. The creation of the first cities was the answer man had been looking for, but now that there was a safe zone, so to speak, where humans didn't have to constantly look over one another's shoulders to respond to threats in the environment, we were able to begin trying to answer other questions. No longer were we only searching for the answer to the question of how best to mitigate chaos and promote self-preservation, which is the natural inclination of all biological entities. Now we were also presented with questions such as, why is there chaos in the first place, or what made this chaos? These are very profound questions for the early man and, well, man in general to attempt to answer, and I think the answers man came up with were only able to be created in a very specific way. The creation of myth was, in my theory, the result of the subconscious interpretation of the environment manifesting itself consciously through psychically anomalous individuals. No, I don't mean like that, so Raven. Now, I know this assertion is kind of crazy and extremely unique, kind of, but hear me out. I'm totally not just saying that early schizophrenic people are the origins of religion. Well, okay, I kinda am, but I'm also saying that I think these subjectively occurring hallucinations are manifested by the lack of, or damage to, the barrier between the subconscious and the conscious interpretations of the machinations of our environment. These hallucinations were then described to the rest of the community as signs from the gods, or divine channels of communication. Think about it like this: would a completely normal person claim that there are voices speaking to them with answers as to how the world worked? Or would persons that truly believed these hallucinations, quote unquote, to be a direct contact with a separate entity, be the ones coming up with these stories? Even though they probably don't come from a separate entity entirely, they come from communication with the subconscious or collective unconscious, possibly, or the deeper self, which was categorized by these early humans as a communication with, for lack of a better term, God of some sort. Of course, it is just as reasonable to assume that maybe what this phenomenon is truly a communication with higher dimensional entities. I mean, it's not like we really know, or, I mean, maybe some people do, I don't fucking know. I believe the latter, anyways, to be far more likely, instead of assuming that the foundations of religion were based on the lies of a cunning manipulator who convinced the public to believe in his fables as to how the world came to be, which is what atheists tend to prescribe to, at least in my experience. To go even further, since these schizophrenic hallucinations aren't completely arbitrary, seeing as they originate from the subconscious, which also actively interprets the world, or from a perspective of higher realization if you prescribe to the notion of interdimensional communication, is it possible that they accurately interpreted the natural world in a better, more complete way through meta-communication and reflection, or maybe better put, as a way from a perspective never experienced before, which would then end up being in a way that was easily understood by large groups of other people? This would be because of the same subconscious ideas and symbolic representations of reality being present in everyone's psyche within a given community due to a shared evolutionary experience. So the words of a quote-unquote mystic or priest or what have you would have then just kind of made sense non-consciously, only able to then be explained in words by these special individuals. This is a change in perspective caused specifically by this rare communication phenomenon between the subconscious and the conscious, instead of only direct conscious interpretation and realization of the environment. Also, it is quite possible that the origin of the subconscious dialogue is transmitted from a different dimension of reality. We only see less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum, guys. Don't let scientific dogma completely blind your experience of reality. So then, Nick, what of all the schizophrenic people in modern Western society that hear voices telling them to kill people or things of that nature? Well, I believe this to be a result of being castrated by secular thought, and this castration resulting in a complete psychosis or a detachment from reality. When people would have schizophrenia in the religiously dominated world of old, or if they have it currently in South America or Asia, which are very spiritual places, these voices are rationalized as being from a higher power and are statistically more benevolent in nature. This is because of societal nurturing, I guess would be the proper scientific term, that aids in a person's rationalization of the source of these so-called vocal hallucinations, because not everyone's a cognitive psychologist and can say, oh, look at me, I'm talking to my most prominent archetype, haha, what up, dude? Instead, most people would be freaked the fuck out and probably seek outside help for a reassurance of their sanity. In the Middle Ages, one would go to a church and tell the pastor of these occurrences, and a narrative would be created by an external force, or dogma, the church, that validated an individual's claim as to be talking to a higher power or being possessed by a demon or whatever. That would fucking suck, dude. Imagine being convinced of that one. In South America, you're told you have access to the spirit realm and are able to communicate with ancestral figures who live on an astral plane beyond our reality. In the West, however, you go to a psychiatrist and are told you are insane and delusional and are immediately put on medication and ostracized by society for being crazy. So naturally, these subconsciously created voices would tend to be malevolent and nefarious as a result of the psyche's environment / interpretation of what these voices actually are, because perception is ultimately reality. From a spiritual perspective, maybe dark energy is able to possess these weakened minds who have been convinced of their quote-unquote delusions, preying on a weakened person's lower vibration. The Western approach doesn't give an answer to the patient, leading them to completely detach. At least that's my way of explaining it. In South America, one would say, sweet, I could talk to spirits. In the US, one would say, fuck, I have no true notion of what is real or not and my life is over. Obviously, this would cause a spiral deeper into insanity, or whatever the rabbit hole that is schizophrenia is, because there are a ton of conflicting ideas and theories, and obviously the nature of psychology is one and rooted in subjectivity. To provide a better proof of this phenomenon being what I describe it to be, I believe it to be necessary to explain the actual teachings of this Sumerian mythos. In Sumerian myth, there are two prominent figures, Tiamat and Marduk. Tiamat was the representation of chaos. Firstly, Tiamat was the goddess of the sea, and in the eyes of humanity, the sea was characterized as the ultimate unknown, dude. The sea represented uncertainty tenfold. I mean, people would go into it and they wouldn't fucking come back, and if you opened your eyes under the sea, you couldn't see very far in front of you, could you? Haha, see what I did there? Oh my god, I did it again. All of these are symbolic representations of chaos. Not only that, but Tiamat manifested herself as a dragon serpent lizard with sharp teeth and scales. So not only did she represent a negative uncertainty associated with the unknowing, she also represented what man had feared since we had begun walking the earth. A large predatory lizard. A serpent, a killing machine that didn't think. This even goes back to the dinosaurs in an evolutionary sense. Us mammalians were preyed upon by carnivorous lizards or birds, thanks modern paleontology for ruining my childhood, for millions of years. This symbology has probably been ever present in our unconscious minds. Did highly creative people, influenced by mystics, come up with these representations? And could it also be that highly creative people are more prone to the types of hallucinations that would truly cause this rationalization of the reason things happen in the world to manifest themselves in this specific way? This way being through mentally anomalous individuals. Because to the Sumerians, these weren't just fun little stories. These were literally explanations for the origin of man and the world that were universally accepted as fact. So anyways, then we have Marduk. Marduk is depicted as a human in royal robes carrying a snake dragon and a spade. This is symbolically significant as the spade represents not just humanity's ability to completely manipulate the environment, which isn't observably present completely in other animals, but also Marduk was known as the god of agriculture, which signifies an extreme difference between man and beast. We refined foraging, we made it out the hood, bro. Not only that, but he carries a snake dragon in his hands, dude. This further represents humanity's taming of the natural world, rising above other animals and becoming the dominant species on the planet. The story goes that Marduk killed Tiamat, who was in fact Marduk's mother. Again, way more symbolism. It is quite obvious then that religion, being an explanation of our world, has a deep relationship with the psyche of man, which is ultimately what birthed it. So then, how is it that religion is a fairy tale? Quite clearly, I've stated that religion is an interpretation, not completely made up nonsense. Even modern religions share ample symbolic congruencies with not just each other, but those that came before them. What with Yahweh and Abrahamic religions being all-knowing or all-seeing, meaning completely void of chaos, and the devil, or Lucifer, being the unexpected wildcard defector that flipped order on its head. So how is it a fairy tale? Well, what is a fairy tale? Nothing more than a myth, correct? Not completely. A fairy tale seeks to answer a question, and by doing so ultimately teaches a lesson. This is why we read our children tales and fables of fantastical heroes performing objectively moral feats, or men coming across and defeating some hardship that manifested itself outside of the control of the said man. We want to instill these values in our offspring. Religion is a fairy tale, but in all the good ways. Religion is the embodiment of humanity's trek into the unknown territory of biospheric dominance, as well as an attempted answer to the implications of having won the battle against chaos, or at least naively believing so in the modern sense because of the evolution, or rather inflation, of man's general ego due to the advancement of technology. But what are these answers to what implications of being the dominant species in the biospheric hierarchy? Well, to be all dominant is to be all powerful, and to be all powerful is to have the capability of being completely destructive, which is an ability man does possess. Religion changed from telling the story of the journey of man's quest against chaos to how man now must face the possibility of self-destruction, not just on a large scale, but also locally, man to man. So did this war against chaos really change, or simply evolve to fit man's newfound ability to create chaos on a global scale, such as the Crusades, or colonization, or the world wars, or nuclear weapons, or even simply pollution? Religion also then, because of this, must have evolved to be a guideline for behavior socially. This is why most modern faiths have stories that showcase how to treat fellow men, or how to treat yourself, also man, as well as usually seeing their god or gods as all-knowing and powerful, instead of being represented by a man with a spade, or elements of the natural world, such as the ocean, like it was with our first go at explaining the world. This was due to the fact that man is now perceived subconsciously as being all-powerful, seeing as we are a sentient apex predator, so we're completely aware of our dominance in the natural world. Because of this, God is the representation of man, and man is the representation of God, instead of natural forces being represented as a divine chaos, such as Zeus and his lightning bolts. It's really obvious obvious when you put it this way, right? Our species has evolved, and along with it, religion has too. And evolving alongside us all this time has been our ethical system, directly influenced by our various pantheons. The evolution of the relationship between man and God is obvious when observed from this larger objective perspective. As man harnessed the powers of nature, grew intellectually, and created real magic with technology, the prospects of God existing begin to diminish. But that natural realization begs questions that are often hard for humanity to answer. If historically morality was derived from religion, then how can mankind without religion, which seems to be the path we are headed on, unless shrooms are legalized, be moral? This is a stance many take, which can be easily refuted when thought about for more than a mere second's passing. Firstly, man created religion, thus man created morals. Thus morals are an innate manifestation of the human psyche. This is an undeniable fact because it is completely observed historically. The Bible, the book about how to treat other people and live your life, just like all the other ancient religious texts, were written by man, not by some supernatural entity in the sky, at least evidently. Modern religious texts are no different from ancient mythology, besides the fact that they are still believed by many, since the teachings of the various churches and sects are ingrained in our society for the time being. Does this mean there is indisputably no real God or creator/controller of the universe? Of course not. There is only indisputably no real, non-figurative, man-made God. And when I say this, I mean man-made God, not man-realized God, which is a stance easily obtained by simply asking one question. Do you have any idea what happens after we die? Does anyone, or has anyone for the entirety of human existence? If nobody does, then why would people ever believe someone that says they know? It's completely illogical and derives itself from a time when the uneducated represented the complete majority of the population. Uneducated people tend to not question the machinations of their control, so why not tell them that if they don't listen to the laws of the church and pay a small get-into-paradise fee, they get lit on fire and stabbed in a hellscape for all of eternity? That's probably evil's biggest finesse ever. The general public literally didn't have the ability to question this prevailing and manufactured mode of thought. Besides the fact that they couldn't intellectually because nobody could read, they risked being ostracized by the entirety of their society and all they know, for instance Giordano Bruno. People seem to think of the absence of religion leading to a morally ambiguous future. However, I see it as the complete opposite. Morality derived itself from religion, which in turn derived itself from man. So then, it is ever present in our society, and the teachings of it are so ingrained that we now see the secular world becoming even more tolerant and morally good than any other time in human history that was almost, at least within 99%, completely religious. Because secular morality is the ethics of religion, just without the tribalism and grandiose bluffs as to whom made the sky. This is a good thing because it means we're still evolving, both socially and spiritually. I believe dogmatic religion to be just one part of this naturally occurring evolution. Or being logical about this stuff is intuitively wrong, and the mystics of old were really just on a higher plane of consciousness and able to communicate interdimensionally with entities that are embroiled in the war between good and evil. Who really knows? That's a joke. I urge you all to look only inwards for God, if that is what you seek, not towards the thoughts of soulless men who seek to gain power over your mind. That is the most important thing to remember on the journey of spiritual awakening. Trust yourself and question everything. As the saying goes, the devil walks the earth holding a cross.